For those of you who might be new, although we have built such a beautiful community here, Centering Justice is a dream space. It's a podcast of possibilities. Every episode, I am amplifying the voices of Black and Brown and melanated folk who are dreamers and change makers and doers and believers who help us shift from the current conditions we're in towards a deeper exploration of what can be. Together, we are holding faith and belief that the future will be different. And on this week's episode, Stories for Changemakers, I'm asking our guest and all of you to think about how did stories and storytelling shape your life and your work? If you've been with us all season, you know that we've been delving into the power of stories and narratives, the challenge of dominant culture beliefs, and how stories bind us and set us free. And in some instances, in many instances, I should say, they keep us apart from each other. Stories were a really important part of my upbringing. And in honor of National Reading Month, I'm inviting guests here today to share some tales that shaped their early years, to talk to us about how those tales continue to resonate, even as adults, and to hold the nuance and complexity of stories in general. So I want you to get ready today for an honest look back at heartwarming tales of our youth and some that are heartbreaking, and for us to hold playfulness, nostalgia, and the celebration of stories that plant seeds of imagination in our hearts. With me today are Lauren Williams and Zach LaRiviere. Really glad that you all are here. Thank you. I want to begin actually with a story. I'm going to share a video, y'all, of a story that my mom would tell me many variations on, and that in the community I grew up in, this character, Anansi, was an important part um, of shaping, my youth. So I'll share this video from one of my favorite shows, Sesame Street, where we get to learn a little bit about Anansi. So I'll share my screen and sound now.
Many, many years ago in Africa, before television or even books, people would tell each other stories. All sorts of stories about what they saw, about the animals, about the land. People from Africa still tell the stories today. Now, they say that all the stories in the world belong to Anansi, the spider. Maybe he'll share one with us.
This story is about monkey and baboon and a compromise. That's when you settle a difference by each person agreeing to give something up. It all started one day when all over the jungle you could hear monkey and baboon screaming at one another. It was very unpleasant. Anansi had to do something. When I found them, they were having a tug-of-war with the checkerboard. "It's my board," screamed one. "You stole my checkers," yelled the other. Back and forth it went until they noticed me there. "Make him stop," they said together. I told them there must be law and order in the jungle, not to mention peace and quiet. Only the great judge can decide this case, I said. I told them where to find him. I did not tell them Anansi was the great judge. I got into my great judge disguise just as monkey and baboon arrived. "Ah, the famous Checkers case," I said in my most judge-like voice. "What we need here is a compromise. In a compromise, you settle a difference by each person giving something up. Therefore, I decree that monkey shall own the checkerboard and baboon the checkers, and you are ordered hereafter to compromise instead of fighting. Case closed." To my delight, the compromise idea seemed to work. It's much quieter in the jungle, at least for now.
So the nostalgia for me, in addition to Sesame Street, and so that was Maria, if you remember from Sesame Street, LaRon and Zach, and also the voice of Ozzie Davis, the incomparable Ozzie Davis, reading that story for us. And I think when I think back on storytelling and stories of my childhood, I think my parents, my mom in particular, was trying to teach lessons as well. And in this one in particular, this lesson of compromise, of collectivism was an important message that came through. I don't know how many of you knew about Anansi, but I want to just I want to tell a little bit about this mythological figure, Anansi, that is probably unfamiliar to a lot of Americans. But his DNA can be found virtually in every story that's told. From elementary school lessons to American pop culture, this Ghanaian spider god has made a centuries-long journey from West Africa that spans almost the entire globe. In the American South, he inspired the beloved Brer Rabbit, and today his eight-legged influence, y'all, can be found in Marvel's Spider-Man. The tales of Anansi originate in Ghana, in the western part of the African continent, and the name actually comes from the Akan word meaning spider. Depictions of Anansi often vary, even within Africa, though the most common in Ghana depict him as a man with 8 legs. The wit and cunning style of Anansi would carry through the centuries in stories inspired by this spider god. And his cunning, in fact, is so legendary that it inspired a whole separate Akan word, anassism, that indicates a story too incredible to believe. And so American kids like me who were watching Sesame Street and who heard Maria narrate those stories and Ossie Davis as the African trickster god himself were, in fact, interacting with the history and the vestiges of the transatlantic slave trade. Anansi came to American shores in part because of that slave trade. And in so doing, he entered into American folklore and was later immortalized in pop culture. When the transatlantic slave trade ripped Africans from our homeland, many of our traditions and cultures died with our freedom. But thanks to the oral history and word of mouth that were done to keep pre-slavery traditions alive, this story did in fact spread, and the stories of Anansi spread throughout the West Indies. They're popular in Jamaica. In fact, when the Jamaican Maroons were shipped back to Sierra Leone in 1800, they took these stories with them. And so Kwaku Anansi originated in Africa, got transported through the Caribbean by way of slave boats, and then made his way back to Africa thanks to those Jamaican revolutionaries. And along the way, he made stops in South America and in various Dutch-controlled Caribbean countries, including Aruba, Bonaire, and Curacao. And I offer this because I think it exemplifies the complexity and nuance of storytelling. And my two guests here today, LaRon and Zach, are also storytellers in their communities and in their own right, and are navigating their own personal, interpersonal, and cultural relationship to stories and storytelling. So thank you both for being here. I'm really delighted to have you and delighted to get together. Yeah. So if you are a guest to Centering Justice, then you know that we believe in whole people and whole worlds. And we always invite our guests to share the identities and communities that they are bringing into this space. So Zach, I want to start with you, if you would, and then LaRon will have you share.
Yeah, thank you, Yodit. My name is Zach LaRiviere. I'm a descendant of Garden River First Nation, also known as Kitagonsabee, and the Canadian side of our Great Lakes borders. I've been called to be a storyteller at times, and participate in ceremonial rites as a firekeeper. I'm an entrepreneur, and I relocated to Southeast Michigan about 3 years ago. But originally, I come from Northern Michigan in the Traverse City area, and spent a lot of time at the Peshawby Town Reservation that's up there. And yeah, I am 31 years old and living in Detroit, and happy to be here today.
Thanks, Zach. Ron, you're on mute, dear.
Thank you, Zach. Thank you, Yodit. And thank you for throwing your age in there, Zach. I've been wondering how old you were. So I'm in my 70s, my mid 70s. I won't tell everybody what that means, but I've been a professional storyteller for about 35 years, and have been living in Ann Arbor for, about 55 years. I started out in Flint, Michigan as the son of two factory working parents who were very exemplary of the community in which we lived. Seemed like everybody there was working in the factories, mostly GM. And it was a community where I was just surrounded by kids. So I heard stories coming from everywhere. My parents had the biggest front porch on the street. So everybody would come to our street and we would talk and we would share things that had gone on and were going on in our lives. And I was a very quiet child, but because I was quiet, I think I soaked up the stories that were told rather than put out things that were inside my mind. So I developed a little storehouse of stories that I could count on. The stories that I tell are focused primarily on putting across messages and ideas. So they're not purely for entertainment. Even when I've been called in to entertain, I find ways to sneak in the truth, what I call the truth of the story, because kids are always asking me, was that story true? And I say, well, it wasn't necessarily true, but it was about the truth with a TH on the end. And then they get to talk about what truth is when they go back to class. So um, that's basically what I do and what I'm about.
Thank
And
you.
yeah.
Speaking of truth, you helped me learn something. You helped me learn the truth. As we were preparing for today's session, I referenced the griot, and you shared with me a truth that I'd heard for the first time. Would you share the context of that word, but also why it is not actually a reflection of someone like you, the storyteller? And the context was, I called you a community griot. I said, you are our beloved griot. And you said, no, ma'am, let me tell you a thing or two. Could you tell the people?
Well, let me add one thing onto that, so I'll try to be brief. You mentioned earlier that we may not know about Anansi as a character, and there are a lot of people in this country who don't realize that they're sharing Anansi stories because Anansi, you talked about the transformation under Anansi underwent in different places. And in the United States, a lot of stories that we hear are called Aunt Nancy stories, but
Yes,
they're about Anansi. His
yes,
name was changed, and
yep.
so we've
Oh, that's such a
inherited.
great point to bring up. I'm glad you
Yeah.
said that. Yeah.
We've inherited a lot of distortions that we don't realize are distortions, and that goes back to the griot thing that um, long, long ago when the French were colonizing Africa, they they picked up on what was happening there, i.e., they saw what I call jales or jeles, who were essentially the keepers of the culture. They were the ones who remembered the lineage of families and cultural traditions that went on. And I happen to know a Jale from West Africa who can trace his entire village history back 500 years, who's related to who and who, so forth. And he doesn't just tell those stories. He plays music and he's an amazing, amazing entertainer. And the French saw the entertainment version of what was happening and they said, oh, these are griots, which is a French word that means essentially it's kind of like a busker, if you all know the word busker, somebody who performs on the street for money. And so they gave this incorrect interpretation of the word to the world. And so today, everywhere you go, you find people calling uh, what are jales or jeles, who have a sacred mission. The jale is second to the king in a lot of cultures, and they reduced it to a street performer. And because they have such influence, we use that word instead of using an accurate word.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of examples like that. So
No, it was such a, I think it really, that experience with you in many ways was sort of symbolic of sitting at the feet of our elders and our ancestors and learning from them, which is such a like cultural tradition for me, right, in my family, but one that is often lost in our culture and society now. In other episodes, we've talked about how we treat our elders and where we keep our elders. And so it was just an unplanned moment with you, LaRon, that for me exemplified what I think about when I think about the storyteller and the story keepers in our family. And I'm really grateful to get that kind of elder check. Like, hold on, be careful what you're saying and who you're calling what. That was great. Um, well, thank you both for, bringing more of yourselves and the communities and histories that you're bringing into space. And LaRon, you mentioned that you were a professional storyteller for 35 years. Some of us got a chance to hear you recently at the Ark tell beautiful stories there. And I wonder if you might share a story with us this morning.
sure, I'd be happy to. I like the part that you said about how we treat our elders and the connection that we have with our elders and or don't have with our elders. And I had my father's father, both my father and my father's father have passed away, but I had an opportunity for a brief time in my life to spend uh, focused time with my grandfather, my father's father, who lived to be 104 years old altogether. And he was completely illiterate. My father was what they call functionally illiterate, but my grandfather had not even 10 minutes in school in his lifetime. Um, but I discovered during those lengthy talks with him that he had an incredible memory, that pretty much everything that I knew about him came to me through story. And in fact, that was influential in I won't say becoming a storyteller, I already was a storyteller, but in developing a commitment to storytelling because my grandfather inspired me to fill a role within both our culture, our family, our culture, and I hope society at large. And so I've got a story that's related to having an incredible memory. It started out a long time ago, as most stories do. Back in 1855, there was a plantation in 1855 where there were lots of enslaved people working, and on that plantation, on that prison camp, um, there was one person in particular who had an amazing memory. He could always remember who said what, when they said it, how they said it, why they said it, who they said it to, and what that person answered back. His name was Sam. Now, you all might think that if you have a memory like that, that your life would be enriched because of your memory. But unfortunately for Sam, he pretty much had to give everything that he had and that he was to the person that the servants and enslaved people called Mouser. And that's how they said it to Mouser. Well, now Mouser didn't have a good memory himself. So every time he went to an important meeting or he had something to do that required memory, he always took Sam along because he knew that Sam could remember who said what, how they said it, when they said it, why they said it, who they said it to, and what that person answered back. Yes, sir. Sam was very important within that context, but unfortunately, again, He wasn't well known outside of that context. Well, now one day, it was a hot summer morning, and old Massa was sitting up at the porch on the front porch sipping lemonade, and to his amazement, all of a sudden, right in front of him, the devil appeared. Now, you don't mistake the devil when you see him, and so Massa knew immediately who it was, and devil walked up to Massa, and he was rubbing his old nasty, bumpy hands together, and he looked at Massa. He said, Massa? Massa said, yes, sir. Devil said, Massa, I got me so many souls down below that I can't keep track of who's down there. I need somebody to help me keep things together. I need Sam. Massa looked at Sam, looked at the devil, and he said, oh, no, 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 sir. You can't take Sam away from here. I mean, now you could take 5 or 6 of these other ones I got around here, but not Sam. His memory is too good. And the devil looked at Mouser and he said, Mouser, I need Sam now. And Mouser said, how about next week? Devil said, now. 15 minutes from now? Now. And Mouser realized the devil was serious. Mouser said, well, is there anything I can do to keep Sam around here? And the devil looked at Mouser and he said, Mouser, I'll tell you what. If you can prove to me that Sam's memory is not as good as I think it is, then you can keep him here. Mouser said, sounds good to me. The devil disappeared. Well, now, while all this was happening, Sam was down in the lower 40 and he was chopping wood and he was singing while he chopped. It's early in the morning. Lordy, when I rise, yeah. All of a sudden, the devil appeared in front of Sam. Devil was rubbing his old nasty bumpy hands again and sweating red sweat. He walked up to Sam and he said, Sam, do you like eggs? And Sam said, yes, sir. As soon as he finished the word eggs, as soon as Sam had said yes, sir, the devil disappeared. Well, now years went by. Time passed, and Sam got older, Massa got older. Even through all the years, they stayed together. Even after the passage of the 13th Amendment, they stayed together. You know about the 13th Amendment. They stayed together, and even as all sorts of enslaved people drifted off and went to other places to live, Sam stayed with Massa. I mean, he didn't know where else to go, and they got close, and Massa would take Sam along whenever he needed him to do something, to remember who said what, when they said it, how they said it, why they said it, who they said it to, and what that person answered back. Time went by, and Sam got married, Massa got married for the 4th time, and they stayed on that estate. They stayed in the same place. Well, now one hot summer day, Massa was 97 years old by that time, and Sam was 90 himself, and it was a hot day, and all of a sudden they both were standing there. Sam was eating his breakfast, and Massa was trying to remember to eat his, and all of a sudden, the devil appeared. Out of nowhere, devil appeared. Hot day, devil doesn't sweat, so devil wasn't sweating at that point. Walked up to Massa, rubbing his hands, and he just laughed. He looked over at Sam and he laughed. Devil said just one word, how? Sam didn't blink. He just held up his breakfast and he said, scrambled. I'm done.
My little brain is
Let's see if you have incredible memories.
how did the eggs get scrambled?
No, let's see if you have incredible memories.
Oh, Zach, what you got?
You don't get
Like for stories, am I turn to tell a story or a reaction to LaRon's story?
Reaction to LaRon, and then you can also tell a story if you would like.
Oh, I love the sentiment behind the story of someone, making a bet like that against their own soul. And then by the time their whole life has gone by, then it comes time to call of, hey, do you remember what you said all of those years ago? The really deep meaning behind that with the answering of the question simply scrambled. I really I like the sentiment of that story a lot, and I feel like it's funny, but also not funny at the same time.
Well, let's make sure everybody got it. So the devil shows up in 1855 and asks Sam, "Do you like eggs?" And then all the years go by, and finally the devil shows up again, and the devil just says, "How?" And Sam holds up his breakfast and says, "Scrambled." So he remembered that question through all those years. Just want to make sure everybody got it.
We got it. We maybe a little slow, but we got it, Laurent. Zach, before you share, I just kind of wanted there was so much there, Laurent, like the vivid imagery when you were saying hot, 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 I almost felt like I could visualize, being in that moment and the eggs in the bowl. And I'm thinking about that in the context of how, and also the descriptions of each character of Sam and of Massa and even the devil. This red sweat coming from the devil and these bumpy hands. And I, some years back, started a program called Black Men Read for my son. And I did that because at the time, his second grade teacher said, Miss Johnson, we don't have, these kids don't see anybody that looks like them, the boys in particular. There are no Black men in this school, not one. My son was in an Ann Arbor school at the time. And it stuck with me that so much of how my identity was shaped was by folks giving vivid images of my future through their eyes, of painting a picture for me that was impossible for me to conceive of as a little one, right? Or watching and hearing references, if we go back to the video I played of a Nazi, like references to Africa that were beyond whatever limited mention of the continent was happening as part of my childhood. And I carry those, much like Sam did for all of those years, still with me now. They're sort of like now at this point a part of my DNA, these stories that my dad and my mom and my family, my grandmother, told. So thank you for like the arc, but also the vivid detail that allow us to establish a relationship with Sam and with Masser and with, dare I say, the devil. Zach, talk to me about stories that resonated for you as a young person or that you're carrying with you now into adulthood.
I think for myself, having been raised in northern Michigan, under a lot of Christian influence and white influence just by proximity in the towns that I was living in, regularly, you hear a lot of Christian-based stories on the story of creation. You hear about, Noah's Ark and things of that nature. And it wasn't until I really started learning my people's creation story that I realized just how, pervasive those concepts were. And one of the things that I learned in my people's creation story is the concept of there being a great flood, which is, in comparison to the Christian story, very similar. The only difference being is there was a separation at some point between who did what and why it all happened. And so that part to me, in my adult life, studying that really helped me understand what has happened to my people's stories over the generations. So the story of creation that I was told, and I will paraphrase some as to not reveal the entirety of the story without the permission of all of the community members that have shared the story with me. But at the beginning of the world was kind of a wicked place. Mankind had not learned the rules as to how we were supposed to conduct ourselves with the spirits. And so therefore the world was flooded. And the only creatures that could survive were the creatures that could swim or the creatures that had found land. But for the most part, humanity was gone. And there was a spirit that gets referenced a lot, a spirit slash man that gets referenced a lot in our stories named Nanabuju. And Nanabuju was tasked with fixing the world after it had flooded. And, no one was around really to help him besides some of the animals who could swim. So he gave the task of helping build the new world to the lowest creature that was still alive, which was the muskrat. And he asked the muskrat to dive down to the bottom of the water that had flooded the whole world and to pull up earth for him. Go down to the bottom and pick up some of the earth that you can find at the bottom of this water. And he tasked the muskrat to do it because no one would have thought the muskrat could have played a role like that. The muskrat humbly accepted his role and did what was asked of him and risked his life and went and retrieved the earth and brought it back up. And Nanabuju put it in his hand and he asked Sky Woman to breathe life into this dirt. And Sky Woman is an often forgotten about spirit in our stories. Gijagokwe is what we call her. She was the one who breathed life into that earth. And when Nanabuju laid it into the water and let it sink, it disappeared into the darkness of the water and came back up as a giant island on the back of a great tortoise. And that's where we get the concept of Turtle Island. And that's why we're surrounded in oceans, because the world was all water. And without Nanabuju and the muskrat, we wouldn't have had land to live on. And so over time, that story got changed into, instead of Gijagokwe, Sky Woman, whom it would make sense that a woman would be able to give birth to life as it is on Earth, was replaced with the concept of Gichimanatu, or Great Spirit, or Creator. And that's a direct co-op movement of God and that sense of a male dominant figure controlling all things that are spirit. They put Gijagokwe and Mother Earth all below Gishimanatu, and that comes from Christian influence, as well as the concept of the Great Flood and having it be a punishment for sins, where it was just a reset on the spiritual part. But the most interesting part about it to me is it sounds pretty benign to replace a character with another character in a story. But when you're talking about that character holds so much moral value to the way that our people used to think, that when we lose something like that, it can change the course of how we treat our women, how we treat the world, and how we look at ourselves. Because now we've switched from the idea that women give birth and create life and give us the purpose to create things that are beautiful. Now we've gone back to the Christian mentality of that man has created the world, that God, the man, is the only one that can give life to all things. And that's just not true to us. And there are many, many natives, especially, at least I can only speak for the Anishinaabe people, there are many who reference Gichimatu or the Great Spirit or, something like that, when if you look at the traditional stories of our people, that did not exist. That was something installed by Christianity. And so as a kid growing up, when I was able to learn these traditional stories, from elders and from family members, it really started painting a picture of a world that I could engage in, that I could be a part of. When I went to those Christian schools, I was isolated. I was one of the only brown kids at the school. I got treated differently. Stories weren't things that I could engage in. They were stories from other places, of different people, of cultures that weren't mine. And so while you can draw sentiment from that, there's not a sense of belonging. And so when I started learning the stories that my people saved for us, the stories that they held on to verbally, that were never written down, that are still here for us, I learned the importance of what those words can be for our people, the importance of knowing that oral history of where we learn our moral system from, because you can see the evidence today of people who had our stories and our languages co-opted by ideas that weren't ours, and how much that changed the course of how my people think, how we view each other, how we view our place in the world, how we view our creation story, how we treat our people, how we treat people outside of our community. All of that comes from stories. Stories are deeply rooted in my culture. And so when you're talking about stories that are not true or people that have changed them, it can cause a lot of irreparable damage in the community. And so that's one thing that I like to talk about when I tell people the concept of creator is not real, while the concept of creation is very real. Creation is what allows all things to exist. Gijigokwe and Mizukumakwe create the space of life for us. They breathe life into things. Creation is the space in which it's allowed to exist. That is the only thing that governs the universe as told by our stories. But there are so many people who have been told stories of Gishamanatu and the Great Spirit, and they wholeheartedly believe that. And so I think that's a great example of, in my youth, of hearing all these stories around me that weren't mine. And then when I did finally get in contact with stories that were from my people, I had to dig even further to escape the touch and the stain of other concept and ideas that were attached to those stories to be able to find out the truth.
Yeah, that's real, Zach. That's so real. I yeah, I I relate to that, having visited the continent of Africa. And when I got back, and people would say to me, well, specifically, I was in Ethiopia when this came up, visiting my own family and lineage and history. And people would be like, well, what was it like? And the best way I could summarize it was that our stories, right? Black folks' stories do not begin with pain. But if you only begin, right, at Turtle Island, if you only begin at the transatlantic slave movement, right, if that is the story and the narrative that is shaping a very myopic view of Blackness, right, you can keep people locked in that. I really appreciate that. And I got to tell you, I don't even know that I can like say this in an eloquent way, but this is also Women's History Month. And to hear out of your mouth, you talk about the role of the feminine divine in your community and in your culture just hit like deep, Zach, like more than just some let's celebrate women in history, but your connection to feminine and divine energy as a part of the creation that we're all experiencing. Just grateful for that. Thank you,
I
Zach.
really appreciate that. And it comes from a genuine place. I was raised by a single mom most of my life. And I saw how hard she worked, how much she sacrificed to make things okay for me, and the love and protection that she gave me throughout anything that I faced. So I know very well a mother's love and the power of women. And so it's my belief that all women are the gateway and the key to the creation of life in the world. And for that, it is a man's job, or anyone else's job for that matter, to protect that sacredness and honor that sacredness, and know that without that love, that motherly love, that feminine energy, none of us would be here. Not a single living human would be here without that love.
Well, I think most women and femme identifying folk on this Zoom know that, and we appreciate maybe that. LaRon, any reactions there?
I'm just thinking, thank you, Zach. And I'm thinking about the power of storytelling. That story has the capacity to transmit to us the things that we need to know in order to make good decisions in the present, things from the past to make good decisions in the present. But it also has the power to alter, to change what has been coming at us as reality. I made a few notes here as I was listening to you, Zach, and I wrote down, you said the story, the Gitchimanatu story sounds benign, right? It sounds benign. And that's
Yeah.
the thing about lots of the stories that we hear when we're kids growing up. They're transmitted to us as fun stories or let's have a good time, right? And not all stories that come to us are going to end up giving us a good time in life or giving us the skills that we need in order to make our lives better. I sometimes I do workshops about creating inclusive community. And I talk about how you can see it pretty clearly on the screen here that I have a gap between my two front teeth, right? This space.
Hey, same here.
Ah. And the community that I grew up in, people used to call that gap, they used to call me rather, a gap-toothed liar in Flint. Yeah. Ooh, you gap-toothed liar. I know plenty of lies be coming out through that space between your teeth. And I just heard this over and over and over again. You gap-toothed liar, gap-toothed liar, gap-toothed liar. So I became the kind of kid who was brutally honest with the truth. I was the kid that if the teacher left the room, I would keep track of who had talked or who had acted up and hand the list over to the teacher and um, that kind of stuff. um, anyway, as I grew older, I started to hear other stories from other places in the world. And in many cases, the pre-enslavement period, Yodit, about how this thing was interpreted. And I heard that in some places in the world, if you have a space between your teeth, it means that you're more likely to own cattle. It's a sign of wealth. I learned that if you have a space between your front teeth, it's a sign that you are beautiful. It's considered a sign of beauty. I learned that in many places in the world, this space is called the eye to God or the eye to deity, whatever the deity would happen to be. And as I learned more stories, different stories, and grew older, I came to realize I get to choose which of those stories I will apply to myself, right? That rather than be a gap-toothed liar, I can be beautiful and own cattle and have a hotline to God. And so, which one do you choose, right? Which one do you choose? I was thinking also about what I call toxic stories versus sacred stories, because there's another thing you said, Zach, and I don't remember, I didn't get the exact words, but it's certain stories that create a sense of belonging. They give you the sense of belonging. Nobody has to come up to you and say, this is your story or this is good for you or whatever. You feel the sense of belonging in the story, right? Those are what I call sacred stories. They're the stories that empower us, make us want to move forward and give us a sense of community and connection and closeness in life. And profane or toxic stories may want us, ask us to do anything. And they're not the kind of stories that we have to choose for ourselves. I feel like I'm talking a long time, so I'll stop.
No, no, you're not. You're doing wonderful. Um, Sacred stories and toxic stories. You tell me about Billy Goat Gruff.
Oh, well, I know that Yodit knows that I did a TED Talk maybe 5 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, and it was the result of a lifetime, an adult life of being a professional storyteller and hearing stories, particularly Western stories, Western culture-based stories that contained what I call toxic paradigms, that there were so many of these toxic paradigms that I heard repeated over and over and over and over and over again. And I suddenly realized, my goodness, these stories, these cultural stories are giving me all sorts of lessons that either don't work in the present or never have worked for me or for certain groups of people. And I'm thinking in particular about people of color. These stories were not stories for us, right? And the Three Billy Goats Gruff is the story that I started using as an example of a ton of toxic paradigms. It's just full of those things.
Give us a little context of the story. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I discovered after I started telling this that a lot of people don't know the Three Billy Goats Gruff story, the original story. So it's a story about these three brothers. Their name is Gruff. They happen to be goats. And let me throw into something. I have a version of this in which they're not all goats, but that's not the one I'm talking about here. Anyway, in the original version, there are three goats, and a little one, a medium-sized one, and a great big one. And they live on one side of a deep valley. On their side of the valley, there used to be enough grass for them to eat, but they ate up all their grass. Talk about expansion and scarcity and environmental justice and so on. But they ate up all their grass, and they had to move over to the other side of the valley in order to eat. Now, the only way they could get over is to go across a bridge. I'm reading the notes here. Go across a bridge, and underneath that bridge, there lived this mean, nasty, despicable, cruel, wicked, fiendish troll. And so they all knew this. They knew that if they tried to cross the bridge, the troll would get them. But the littlest Billy Goat Gruff was so hungry, he got too hungry to be able to contain himself, and he runs across the bridge, and the troll comes up and says, "I'm going to eat you up." And the littlest goat says, "Don't eat me. My bigger brother is much bigger and much more delicious and tasty," and so on. The troll says, "Okay, go ahead." And the same thing happens with the second one. He says, "Okay, go ahead." And then the third goat comes, but this goat is huge. And when he comes up to the troll, he butts the troll off the bridge down to the bottom of the valley, dead. Kills him dead. Because there's the good guy, bad guy paradigm in this story. And you all know good guys get good things, bad guys deserve anything that happens to them. So we don't have to cry. We don't have to feel bad when the bad guy dies or the bad guy gets mutilated beyond recognition. That's okay, because bad guys deserve anything. So we get this hierarchy of life built in there. We get the whole notion of expansionism and eternal frontier that we can just go over and take woven into there. We get the idea that of clannishness, that your family is the only group that you have to pay attention to, and the only way you can be safe is to reinforce that. So there are lots of ideas. You get the idea that violence is a viable means to solve problems. That's built right in there, and there on and on and on it goes. So it's a good example of the nature of the toxic stories that come at us. Now, that's not to say that that we can't learn from toxic stories. We can learn from toxic stories. In a way, my grandfather, having an incredible memory, was his way of learning from toxic stories that he had heard around him. He's functionally illiterate, or rather, he's illiterate, and he's told that all the time. My father, functionally illiterate. You can't function. You can't. He heard over and over and over again. But he taught us, as you were kind of telling me, Yodit, about one of your family who accomplished great things. My grandfather had 8 kids. My father had 5, and raised families and transmitted to them positive values, and they did all kinds of things.
Yeah. Well, I the context for that with me, after starting Black Men Read, people want to put it in a box as a literacy program, right? Oh, you're a literacy initiative, and we're not. We are a storytelling program.
Mm.
We have 2 aims: uplift Black men and disrupt the myth that they aren't involved in their families or communities, and to share with all children the power of storytelling born of the African diaspora. And to center in the stories that we share Black and brown protagonists, to disrupt this idea that often our children are the other.
Mm.
And so the resistance to calling BMR a literacy program is not because we don't want kids to read. Obviously, we do. We're trying to put a Black book in the personal library of every kid in this county. But that literacy is less about the written word and more about the ability to interpret your world. And a powerful affirmation of this is a man that I went to church with. I saw him every Sunday for years and years and years. We sang together, we prayed together, we worshiped together. And one day at the start of church, the pastor said, this person wants to share a testimony. And their testimony was that they had just graduated from a local adult literacy program. And they were mid-70s like you. And their story was that prior to joining that program, they had lived their entire life, as you call it, functionally illiterate, which is to say They could not read and they wrote very little. And this person had been a productive, contributor to their family and to their community and to our church. And they had worked and lived and gotten by, just fine. And it completely upended the narrative that I'd had around literacy, right? Around what it means to be high functioning. And I kept, I hold on to that. It was such a powerful moment for them as well, as they were sharing what they had, why they had chosen this, which was about their grandbabies, right? And their lineage. It wasn't so that they could go to, college or get a better job or any of that. It was so they could read to their grands, and so that they could encourage a love of learning among their family. And so these toxic stories, Zach, kind of curious as well. We have such nostalgia about children's stories. And especially, I think, in the West, where, this is a tradition and a practice to read stories. And Laurent, you've already revealed the ways in which even our beloved childhood stories are often teaching us lessons. I think about Anansi was really a Ghanaian god. And in US translation of Anansi, he's a hero, right? Spider-Man, right, is a hero. So depending upon where you enter into that narrative, you have completely different understanding. I wonder how many kids that watch Spider-Man know the roots of that history and connection to Anansi. So Zach, I'm just kind of curious, as we're talking about the way stories get co-opted and the ways that some of the folklore, that we've heard all along, how is that present for you, and when you think about Native and Indigenous tradition and the like?
Well, thanks for that story, Laurent, and thank you, Yodit, for your story as well. I think a good example of a specific story that I'd like to touch on, that hasn't necessarily been co-opted, but because of the way that it's written, it couldn't have been anybody but my communities. And that's something that was really amazing to me, is that you can tell an Ojibwe story from any other story, because a lot of our stories are very realistic. There's not this sense of this separation between spirit and human. There's not this separation of hierarchy of who can be closer or more connected. So a good character that I'd like to talk about is Nanabuju. Nanabuju is one of the most important characters in Anishinaabe culture. It's to the point where when we say hello to people, we say Anibuju. We reference him every time we say hello, because we're asking somebody. Like, the full phrase is Ani Ginananabuju, which means, hello, are you Nanabuju? Because you always want to check when you're talking to someone if they're Nanabuju, because if you call him out by name or call them out by name, he's more ambiguous. He will appear to you, and Nanabuju will reveal himself to you. And that being said, Nanabuju is someone we look up to, we learn from, but he's also a trickster. He's also a failure in a lot of ways. He's a troublemaker, and he has very, very human flaws. And one of the best stories that I think exemplifies that is a story where Nanabuju, in his many travels across the country, he went around speaking with many different clans of people, and trying to figure out what he could do to help. And there was a village he came across that was a village of Bear Clan people. And off the coast of their village, there was an island, and there was a really powerful and terrifying warrior who lived on that island by himself and would come to their town and raid it and take people and food and, cause all this violence and chaos. And so when Nanabuju gets to town, the people ask him, because they know he's a Manatu. He may appear as a man, but he's a Manatu. And so they ask him, hey, this guy's terrorizing us. Can you help get rid of him? And Nanabuju's pride, welled up with him, like, oh, these people think I can beat this guy. And his pride pushed him to do a task that he wasn't sure that he could do. And so he's like, yeah, of course, I'll get rid of this guy for you. I'm the great and powerful Nana Buju, and I'll go kick him off this island. I'll just need you guys to send some warriors around the other side of the island to back me up for when I'm all done. And so they said, okay, yeah, we'll be on the other side of the island and we'll meet you over there. So Nana Buju gets in his Gimon and he paddles all the way out to the island and he starts looking for this big guy. And as he's in the woods, he hears the warrior yelling and screaming and being loud. And he starts seeing bones all over the place. And, all these signs of violence has occurred. So he's scared. He starts to get real nervous in those woods by himself, looking for this guy and waiting for him to pop out anywhere and attack him. So as Nana Buju's walking, he hears a really loud noise and it scares him. And so he takes off to the woods, and everyone said Nana Buju could run as fast as the wind. So he's flying through the woods, screaming at the top of his lungs, running around in circles. And what he didn't know, that as he was doing that, the warrior who was at his camp hears somebody running through the woods and screaming. And Nana Buju is running so fast, it sounds like he's surrounded by warriors. So he runs out of the woods directly into the arms of the war party that was waiting on the other side of the island, and they beat him. And so then after they beat him, they all come to Nana Buju and say, you did so amazing. You scared that man right out of the woods, right to us. And what they didn't know was that Nana Buju was a coward the entire time and was running in fear for his life and confused the warrior. And it was very human. And the lesson in that being whatever you could take from it, because our people never laid out the lesson for you and said, this is why he did this, and this is why this was this way. We gave the tools to our people to understand it. And so the lesson that I got from that story was that your pride is dangerous for yourself and for those around you, and that a fool is the one who carries too much pride. And that's why they portrayed Nana Buju to be a fool. And that was my people's way of, our greatest leader, deity, person that we look at for an example of how to conduct ourselves was not a higher being that was all powerful or perfect morally or made all the right decisions. It was very much someone who made mistakes. And for me, that felt like a positive story because it allows you to draw lessons from it that aren't directly given to you. Whereas like some stories, they lay it out right for you. Hey, this is the lesson of the story and this is what you should get out of it. And so something I appreciated about that story was it left some things up to interpretation. Like that the idea that the common person could defeat the great monster. Nana Buju didn't beat that guy. The whole group of people went and beat him because they worked together. And the idea that, all conflict must be faced with bravery and violence, it just showed that whole conflict was met with real fear and it was still okay. And that we can honor the feelings that we feel. And when we come across these different situations in life and handle it that way, there's not one way to handle things and there's not one way to be. And to be reminded that pride can often lead us to making the poor choices, I think was the major theme behind that story.
This moment happens every episode of Centering Justice, where I'm convinced that the spirits and the ancestors have conspired for us, each of us that's here in this moment, to receive like a holy word. And what you just said, this invitation to holding nuance and complexity, this invitation to understanding our ties to each other, that we need each other. This idea that there isn't always some perfect moral reference point for each of us to, tether ourselves to, right? That some of the most powerful shifts happen when we witness people in their realest, rawest moment, not in, sort of their best idealized,
Mhm.
moment. And I just bless all of the entities that came together for me to hear that from you. And I also, Lauren, I see you came off of mute, but Zach, I wanted to take a moment to also appreciate that many Native and Indigenous sacred stories have been stolen, and that
Mhm.
is a gift that you would share that story with this community, even if it's slightly modified to protect the sanctity of the story. It doesn't fall lightly on me that you did that in this public space, and I can commit to not repeating it, but holding it dear inside. Thank you so much for that. Lauren, what were you
Thank
going to
you.
say?
Oh, I also thank you, Zach. I greatly appreciate that you shared what you're able to share
Mhm,
of your culture. I know some people um, who their entire careers are built around taking the stories from other cultures and publishing them without giving credit, without caring about the effect that they have on the communities from which they're taken. And I'm
mhm.
thinking of one person in particular right now, but I won't repeat the name. Um,
Mhm,
and yes, the complexity of the cultural experiences, the cultures from which all of our stories come, and the capacity to take the best of what we have and the best of who we are and make our best choices for
mhm,
how we're going to move forward is something that I hope we can hold on to. We're right now being force fed a single story of
mhm,
what's important and how we should live. And I think we mentioned the name of Chimamanda Adichie Ngozi Adichie.
mhm,
Um, and she has a wonderful, wonderful TED Talk that you can watch on YouTube called "The Dangers of a Single Story." Um, there's a West African proverb that says that, quote, "The man who hasn't been anywhere thinks that his mother makes the best soup in the world." And until he has some soup outside of his house and he realizes, well, my mom's soup is good, but it's amazing. And so I always encourage people to get out there and share our stories with each other um, and learn what we can learn from other stories, other experiences. And
You
there's
talk
a
about oh, I'm sorry.
oh, I was just going to say there's a story that I usually end with. I feel
Mm,
like we're starting to wrap up, but
not
it's very
quite,
brief.
but
It's
yeah,
very brief.
please, please.
So there was a time when so you all know that Obatala in Western Africa and Nigerian Yoruba culture, Obatala is responsible for giving all the animals their appearances. So Obatala gave spots to the leopard and stripes to the tiger and so on, and just created the look. Obatala gave wings to the insects and so on and so on. And one important thing I would like to mention about Obatala is that Obatala is neither man nor woman, but both. So includes both, but is not either. That's the way Obatala is conceived of. At any rate, Obatala wanted to give all the animals their own special looks, and so Obatala had all the animals line up in a great big line, and the animals started to walk in front of Obatala. Well, now at the front of the line were spiders, and they were given the ability to spin webs and tell tales. Um, Right behind them were the fish that were given the ability to breathe underwater. All the animals were receiving these amazing gifts. Now, animals back in the back of the line felt like, well, maybe the animals at the front of the line are getting better gifts. So they started to push and to shove and to scratch and to claw at each other the best they could because they didn't yet all have claws the way they eventually would and so on. But um, a fight broke out, and there was one small animal that ran around and tried to settle that fight. Eventually, order was restored. all the animals walked in front of Obatala and they received their gift. Well, now when that one small animal came up at the back of the line, Obatala said, because you tried to help settle the fight, I'm going to give you not one gift, but two. And that's how human beings were given the ability not only to reason, but also to speak. Because speech without reason is gibberish. Reason without speech is practically useless. And so that's how I usually end. Use those gifts that Obatala gave us and create inclusive communities.
Yeah, thank you for that. I want to ask, Zach, you took a story, I hadn't heard of it in a while, the story of Paul Bunyan, but I do
Yes.
remember it as part of childhood folklore. And tell me your perspectives on the story of Paul Bunyan, please.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, LaRon, for sharing that story. Thoroughly enjoyed that, and the message behind that. Really appreciate that. Yeah, so Paul Bunyan, I'm sure everybody in Michigan has heard that name one time or another. Someone's been to a Michigan State game and seen them hoist the Paul Bunyan trophy and, things like that. The name gets referenced a lot. But what people don't know is that Paul Bunyan and the idea of him being this giant white man who was chopping down trees came during a time of a lot of major Native American land grabs in northern Michigan and Canada and Minnesota and Wisconsin, where the legend of Paul Bunyan became born from. I mean, you're talking about one of the largest lumber operations in American history happened right here around the Great Lakes because of the ease of being able to send logs through the Great Lakes to their points of origin, to their points of shipping and have them shipped around the country. So this became a very advantageous place for mass logging. And so the concept of Paul Bunyan was born, this big, strong white man with his big blue ox that could come through the woods and take down a tree in a single blow. And they put statues of him up north. They have baseball fields named after him. There's pictures of, drawings of him in museums. And what people don't know is that during the time period when the great logging thing, operations were happening in northern Michigan, there was many lands that were owned by Native families, even deeded out from the French and from the original American government that were on deeds that got grabbed up by these logging companies or bought at basement prices because the people who lived on the land were starving and needed money and didn't have a source of income. And so they did that and they bought these lands and then logged them into oblivion. And now in those places that have been logged, which used to be historical hardwood forests that my people lived in and cared for and were stewards for thousands of years, became acidic pine rows where nothing can grow besides pine. And there's entire areas of northern Michigan now that are just acidic, sandy piles of nothing because of the way that the logging industry moved through it. And their solution was to just plant all these trees. So this heartwarming story of, Babe the Blue Ox and Paul Bunyan that a lot of people cherish as, northern Michigan and, northern Midwest lore is actually a representation of a horrible logging industry that damaged the lives of many, many Native Americans within the Great Lakes region. And a lot of people were cheated out of their homes, out of the land that had been historically theirs, out of a seat at the table with the money that was flowing out of northern Michigan. And to the point where most of those properties now have been owned by white families, by farms and such for the last 200 years, and people don't have any recollection that it was deeded out to Native Americans prior to those major land grabs in northern Michigan. And so it's just an example, I think, of something that seems like a really safe, story. Oh, what's so harmful about some guy who's a giant and can chop down a tree in one swing? Well, it's more about the representation of what his symbol means and to my people. When you see the giant white man wearing lumberjack equipment and you're a Native American person, it's not something that instills a feeling of joy or cuteness in you when you know that that was the direct result as to why many of our families got left out of things.
Thank you. I felt like that was so important. This month it is important for us to shine a light on the experiences of women and women identifying folk, right? But the roots of International Women's Day come out of struggle, not out of celebration. And it's easy, I think, for us to allow social media or just the assumption that what we're hearing is true to again impact that like sort of nuance and complexity. So Zach, I thought it was really important for you to say that and to share that the way that stories impact us as well, the way these insidious and horrific systems get baked into, narrative, right? And can completely alter our understanding of history or our understanding of the space that we're in. And that's why we've spent this season really talking about the importance of narrative strategy. Because if you are not shaping and sharing the story, it is being written for us, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Instantly.
So
And I would like to just real
yeah,
fast comment on what you had said about it being, National Women's History Month. I just wanted to take a moment to uplift and bring awareness to the problem that plagues the Native American community of missing and murdered Indigenous women. There are many MMIW movements and organizations that help with investigations, lawyer fees, court fees, things of that to help women get justice. And so I wanted to just take a moment to uplift that and let everybody know that, Native American women are one of the number one most vulnerable groups in America for assault, murder, and or sexual assault. And so I want to highlight that as a major problem because a lot of people don't talk about Native women and the things that they've had to overcome and the things that they have to deal with now. So I want to take a quick moment for everyone to recognize the problem of missing and murdered Indigenous women and do what you can at the local level to try to help the organizations who do that good work to help people.
thank you for that, Zach. We have a little bit of time before we wrap up, and this is generally the time where I ask guests if there's something that's on your heart or that you want to share that I haven't asked you or that's percolated amongst yourselves. And also, our audience, if you have questions of Zach or Lauren, those can go into the chat. Of course, your love for them throughout and you giving them love has, I think, buoyed our conversation. But LaRon or Zach, anything else kind of on your heart related to storytelling and the stories of our youth and the stories of our contemporaries?
Lots of things have been going through my mind. So, you know, when we think of story in this culture, generally, we think of extended narratives or something that's, lasts a long time. But stories take many, 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 many forms. And, there are proverbs, there's a single word, there's the TV commercials, there are jingles and songs and all sorts of ways that stories are conveyed. And I was saying a while back that it's important for us to take that huge amount of information that we're receiving and run it through the sieve of what works, what is sacred for us. And when I say us, I think of the expanded us, all of us humans on Earth trying to make this thing work for all of us. And so the thing that we talked about, learning from our past and moving forward into a future that is functional for all of us. I just want to put that back on the table for consideration. And I like to say too that it's declaration that makes things possible. That's declaration. That we can declare the kind of world that we want to see. There's nothing that says it has to come from someplace else, or that I'm very critical of certain statements that people make about what our rights are, and that they have to be given to us from someplace or somebody else. And you can declare what it is that you want to see and commit to working toward that. And I think about that phrase. I first heard it as an expression stated by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., but I have since found out that he wasn't the first or only person to say it, that there was a Unitarian minister named Theodore Parker who I think was the first one to say it. At least that's what I'm hearing. Anyway, it is that the arc of the moral universe bends toward is long, but it bends toward justice. It's long, but it bends toward justice. And I think about that, and I have a great deal of respect for Dr. King. I will say that first. But how does Dr. King know what the moral universe does, right? The universe is huge, and the arc could be almost infinite. Dr. King isn't sure that it bends toward justice, nor is Dr. King sure that the universe is moral at all. I think what Dr. King was doing by making that statement was making two declarations. One, that I declare the universe is moral. That's the direction I want to see it move. And that it bends in the direction of justice. But I think also Dr. King would be the first person to say it doesn't bend because of gravity. It bends because of what we make happen, that we have to cause it to bend toward justice. So for me, storytelling is a wonderful avenue toward accomplishing that. That's what I'm taking with me.
I think for myself, and thank you for sharing that, Laurent. I think for myself, the thing that I've taken from this and all of these conversations we've had is the importance of knowing where stories come from, and also knowing that we decide what morals we digest. We decide what lessons we want to take. And because of that, there's a significant amount of responsibility on us to do our part in knowing where these stories come from. But I also like to remind people that you don't need to know all the stories to be able to be guided. You can listen to other people. We can share our personal stories that have nothing to do with a fable or a tale from the past, but that our stories of our current lives and the things that we go through. We may not know it, but sharing your story with somebody can heal something. Sharing your story with someone can give them guidance and maybe something that they're going through. And I really feel centered upon the idea that our words are far more powerful than we understand, whether it be for the negative or for the positive, but that we can have an impact through words and interhuman connection in that way, and be reminded that our stories are constantly developing, and how we conduct ourselves is how our characters develop as well. And that's not to be decided by anybody else or anything else.
So beautiful. So beautiful. You are getting lots of love in the chat. Susan said, thank you, Laurent and Zach. Angela, thank you, Zach. So important to remember about missing and exploited Indigenous women. And they asked if you had any organizations too that you would recommend they connect with.
I would say, depending on your locale, now MMIW is more of a movement, and they have a figurehead of the red hand. And so there's a lot of organizations that work under that figurehead. But the best way that I would say is find a local organization. And I don't have any maybe necessarily in Ann Arbor that I'm aware of. But I do know that if you look at local MMIW groups that are doing that kind of work, there are many, they come under many different names, but the most important thing to look for is that association with MMIW, and also that it's a Native-led coalition. Some people don't advertise that they do that work online. Some people don't advertise it anywhere, because some of that work in helping those women can be very clandestine and secretive. So it is kind of hard to get in contact with those people, but I would suggest that you attempt to find organizations and see what can be done about it. And even in small ways, even if you don't contact an organization directly, follow some tribal councils, follow some local reservations newsletters, follow those on social media, and they post missing people all the time. So you can share those posts, you can get the word out for those people and help more people become aware of it, because that's the biggest problem, is that most people, when a Native woman goes missing in like a reservation in North Dakota, nobody hears about it. And that's the biggest problem. If you put more ears and eyes on it and more people raise, a question about what happened to somebody, that's what gets things done the most. So I think just tapping in and listening and being ready for when our people need help and when we ask for help, that we just amplify the help that's being asked for.
Mhm. Jessica Lita, who's in the audience, put something in chat as well. And thank you for amplifying that. And if others know of organizations, I did put MMIW into, Dawn just added Native Hope into the chat. So I want to create together a story where no Native or Indigenous woman or girl is missing. That's the story I want us to weave together, that no girls or women are missing, but particularly those whose stories and whose disappearances are lesser known.
Mhm.
I think we can weave that together. One of my favorite artists that we featured in Black Men's Reads 2024 Black Books that every kid should have, and I linked that for you, is a story written by Harold Green. And it's all about words. But Harold was recently, he is also a spoken word artist, and recently shared a poem that I'm going to use to wound us out, that is in honor of Women's History Month, and is named Flowers for the Living. So I'll invite those who are able to watch along and listen along, and then we'll say goodbye, okay? For now, until next time.
Then which one are you? Fighting through the fog just to get a good selfie. Even if you don't like the view, you still put on face and try to leave without a trace. But in nightmares are the only place where you fall from grace. In dreams, it helps you wake before you break. But you're still wandering around in a constant haze, trying to rage your way through the maze. Burning sage, battling Babylon, lost in Zion. But how you gonna rebound when the weight of your expectations keep pulling you down? And every assist just turns into a 360. So you're right back where you started. They say sleep is the cousin of death. So I guess all these dreams are just our daily departure, resting power naps to our dearly departed. Your journey really started when you realized that the only currency you were receiving was a reality check. And then it took the world to stop for you to realize that you couldn't even afford to reflect. It took Maxine Waters for you to realize that time is your biggest asset. Because if you go up in smoke, then you're only an insurance policy. You only become dangerous when you start controlling your own destiny. A bomb is hard to use when you can't find the fuse.
A bomb is only usable when you can find the fuse. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Zach and Lauren, thank you for your presence today. We welcome always feedback on the episode. So Jess is dropping a survey link for those of you who are in our audience today. And we welcome donations that allow us to support the show, that allow us to compensate our speaker collaborators for their time, and that allow us to amplify Centering Justice, which will be officially a podcast soon, very soon. So we welcome that as well. You can donate at www.new.org. Thank you again.